Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey into the world of Greek mythology. But we're leaving the screaming, the heroics, and the dramatic, terrifying monsters right on the doorstep. Instead, we're going to spend the next hours focusing on the most utterly mundane, sleep-inducing detail of all, the surprisingly boring diet of the Cyclops. You probably picture a colossal, one-eyed brute, crushing human skulls and tossing sailors into a blazing fire pit. You see Odysseus, the brave, clever hero, escaping by the skin of his teeth from the terrifying man-eater. Polyphemus. That image is sharp, visceral, and totally wrong, at least for the vast majority of their lonely, monotonous lives. I want you to imagine you are there now. Not on the ship, not sneaking around the cave, but right outside, on the grassy, wind-swept Sicilian hillside. The air is thick with the scent of salty sea spray and something less dramatic, lactic acid. That heavy, slightly sour aroma of unwashed wool, damp earth, and, most predominantly, aging cheese. You can hear the rhythmic clomp-clomp of heavy livestock and the low, throaty sound of a creature utterly disinterested in you. You are not a hero, you are a trespasser, a calorie source, an infrequent and exotic meat. But what did they eat the other 364 days of the year? That's where the sleepiness sets in. We are entering a world of gruel, curds, and tough mutton, a world so bland it will soothe your modern, overstimulated brain straight to sleep. If you're here for gore and spectacle, I'm afraid you probably won't survive this. The sheer monotony might just do you in. It's less Clash of the Titans and more Bronze Age dairy farmer quarterly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments and what time it is. It's a nice little ritual we share before the history begins. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking closer to the mouth of the cave now. The sheer rock face cool against your hand. The massive entrance is dark, and the air is noticeably cooler and damp. Your initial fear of being instantly crushed is replaced by a profound sense of dullness. This isn't the lair of a demonic beast, it's the large, messy shelter of an isolationist. Large-scale shepherd. The evidence is everywhere. Piles of dried dung, the bleating of enclosed goats, and the unmistakable smell of unpasteurized dairy. The history you learn in school usually skips over this, focusing on the thrilling parts. But one mainstream historical fact we need to acknowledge is that the concept of the Cyclops, at least the Homeric version, is fundamentally rooted in the early Greek perception of uncivilized, non-agricultural peoples. They represent the rough, self-sufficient, non-urban existence that the polis-dwelling Greeks both feared and romanticized. They weren't just monsters, they were the embodiment of pre-social existence. And their diet was a mirror of that primitivism. You look around and see a few rough implements. No fancy Minoan pottery, no Mycenaean gold, just heavy, unrefined tools. The whole scene screams self-sufficiency. But not in a cool, minimalist way, more in a, this is all I have, and I don't care, kind of way. This brings us to a quirky tidbit about the ancient Mediterranean diet. The sophisticated Greeks ate lying down, often reclining on couches, but the Cyclops, embodying the opposite of refinement, would have simply squatted or sat on the dirt to eat, tearing at food with their hands. Their life had no grace, and their meals had no table manners, because they had no one to impress, not even themselves. The narrative of Polyphemus eating raw sailors is so powerful. It completely overshadows the reality that the primary source of their calories was their flock. You step inside, and your eye adjusts to the gloom. The first thing you notice is a vast, messy storage area filled not with plunder, but with the practical necessities of a pastoral life. There are woven baskets filled with dry legumes and rough-hewn wooden containers packed with aged cheese. Their diet, day in and day out, was a relentless cycle of using the products of their livestock. This is the foundation of their surprisingly mundane existence. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops were originally meant to be seen as literally monstrous giants, or simply a savage, oversized metaphor for the rough tribes of Sicily who existed outside the organized Greek world. If they were the latter, their diet makes perfect sense. It would be the diet of the remote, self-sustaining farmer, just on an enormous scale. You see a large, blackened stone, not a sacrificial altar, but a practical hearth. The thought of this massive creature carefully boiling milk for hours to separate the curds is almost comical. It's the ultimate anticlimax. Their legend is fire and blood, but their daily reality is milk and monotony. This is the key to understanding the next phase of their culinary life, the inescapable routine of tending to their sheep and goats, which provided not just meat, but their very caloric backbone. The fear they instilled in others came from their size and isolation, not the contents of their pantry, which was, let's face it, just a lot of cheese. You're starting to relax into the damp air of the cave. The initial dread has melted away, replaced by the deep, resonant sense of a life lived by natural rhythms, devoid of external pressure. Remember that thick, sour scent of lactic acid we noticed? That's your first and most important clue to the Cyclops' true default role: shepherds of the sea. Forget the image of them standing on cliffs throwing boulders at ships. Their real job, the one that kept them alive and defined their diet, was tending their vast flocks of sheep and shaggy goats. You watch, or perhaps imagine, because the Cyclops is asleep now, breathing a low rumble that vibrates the very ground, a huge, hairy hand reaching for a milking bucket. Their lives were entirely tethered to these animals. They weren't just pastoralists, they were isolationists who had perfected the art of converting grass into portable, storable calories, primarily through dairy. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact about ancient subsistence. Across the Mediterranean and the Near East, the transition from nomadic hunting to settled herding provided a reliable, renewable food source for remote groups like the Cyclops, who scorned agriculture. The ability of sheep and goats to graze on marginal land made them the perfect, almost mandatory, resource. Their meat was a bonus. But the true wealth, the daily, indispensable calorie, was the milk. Think about the sheer scale. Polyphemus, for instance, is described as milking the ewes and goats in the Odyssey. We tend to focus on the human consumption, but Homer sets the scene with meticulous detail about the routine of herding. This suggests a massive operation. Imagine how much milk one Cyclops would need to consume to fuel his gigantic body for a day. We're talking gallons. This necessitates a relentless, boring commitment to the herd. You trudge out before dawn. You move the flocks to new pasture. You oversee the complex, messy business of milking, and you start the long process of preservation. It's not thrilling. It's the opposite of thrilling. It's like an endless, repetitive dairy farm simulator. You notice now the piles of wool shorn from the sheep. It's thick, coarse stuff, destined for rough blankets or perhaps just tossed aside. Here's a quirky tidbit that underscores their primitivism. Unlike the sophisticated Greeks who used olive oil as their primary source of fat and for bathing, the Cyclops would have relied heavily on lanolin, the naturally occurring wax in sheep's wool, to treat their coarse skin. It's an internal-external economy of the flock. Food, clothing, and even basic skincare all come from the same source. A greasy, sheep-scented existence, all due to their rejection of agriculture and external trade. You step over a pile of dry, compressed fodder, straw or perhaps rough grasses. The diet of the Cyclops is simply an extension of the diet of their animals. It's a closed-loop system. Grass becomes goat. Goat becomes milk. Milk becomes the Cyclops' breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The simplicity is staggering. There is no variety, no spice, and certainly no 4-star rating. You wouldn't even rate it 1 star, unless you were rating for pure survival utility. That's joke number 1. Welcome to Shepherd's Survival Shack, now serving the same meal they served yesterday. When Odysseus lands, the Cyclops isn't actively hunting humans, he's managing his stock. He drives his fat-tailed sheep and goats into the cave at night. And he seals the entrance to keep them safe from other predators, including, it turns out, tiny, meddling heroes. The man-eating aspect is less a regular culinary habit and more a violent act of primal territorial defense. To the Cyclops, a sailor is just an unregistered, two-legged goat trying to steal his cheese. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops were completely ignorant of agriculture. As Homer suggests, they neither plant nor plow, or if this was hyperbole meant to emphasize their barbarity compared to the grain-eating, Wine-drinking Greeks, if they were truly ignorant of farming, their reliance on the self-sufficient, mobile dairy economy becomes even more absolute. There is no fallback, no seasonal wheat harvest, just milk, milk, and more milk. Look over at the rough stone basin. It's probably a crude water trough for the animals. But it also serves as a general mixing bowl. The Cyclops has no fear of contamination or spoilage, because to him, the earth is his kitchen. We, with our modern obsession with refrigerated variety, find this hard to imagine. A diet based overwhelmingly on just 2 or 3 items: milk, its derivatives, and the occasional tough carcass. It's the ultimate embodiment of necessity dictating cuisine. The next time you open your refrigerator and stare at the dozens of options, remember the Cyclops, standing in his cool cave, staring at a giant mound of cheese curds. That's dinner. That's every dinner. It's the most reliable, and most boring, diet in Greek myth. The focus of the Cyclops' existence, as you now know, orbits around the dairy economy, milk, curds, and whey. Step deeper into the cave, past the sleeping Polyphemus, whose snores sound a bit like a malfunctioning cement mixer, and you'll see the primary product of his labor. It's not piles of gold or exotic spices, it's just a massive, pungent, and highly perishable white industry. The abundance of milk dictates everything about their cuisine. The Cyclops has no refrigeration, no complex straining mechanism, and absolutely no need for presentation. His approach to food preservation is raw, direct, and brutally efficient, relying on natural processes and the chemistry of milk itself. You see large baskets made of woven reeds, lined with rough animal skins, acting as his vats. These aren't for display, they're where the magic, or rather, the monotony, happens. You watch as the day's warm milk, still slightly foamy, is poured into these crude containers. The process of converting liquid milk into solid, storable food is central. It's a mainstream historical fact that cheese production was developed very early in human history. Evidence suggests around the 8th millennium BC, precisely because it converts a highly perishable liquid, milk, into a calorie-dense, portable, and long-lasting solid, cheese. For the Cyclops, isolated and needing to store food without fire or salt mines, this process was his life support system. The key ingredient, besides the milk itself, is the rennet. You'd expect the Cyclops to have some kind of massive, industrialized supply, but he doesn't. He uses the simplest, most primitive method: a dried segment of the stomach of a young, unweaned lamb or kid. This lining contains natural enzymes that, when introduced to the warm milk, cause it to rapidly separate into solids, the curds, and liquid, the whey. It's organic chemistry at its most basic and most effective. You look at a massive lump of semi-solid cheese near the entrance. It's rough, probably slightly gritty, and deeply sour, a far cry from your grocery store Gouda. The majority of the Cyclops' intake would be these very simple, unaged, and highly acidic cheeses. They are essentially fresh curds, what we might call protocheese or a form of farmer's cheese. Because the Cyclops doesn't need trade or variety, he also doesn't need complex aging. The faster it solidifies and can be eaten or stored, the better. Now, for a quirky tidbit about this ancient process, the use of animal stomachs as a vessel and a catalyst means that the Cyclops' food would have a distinctive, gamey flavor. The very container that holds the milk is the source of the enzymes that curdle it. It's a deep, continuous flavor profile, one that would quickly become boring to anyone but the most dedicated survivalist. Imagine eating nothing but intensely sharp, sour cottage cheese that tastes faintly of goat belly. 3 times a day, every day. It's enough to make you drift right off just thinking about it. There's joke number 2. You could say the Cyclops was truly committed to farm-to-table dining, provided the table was just a rock and the farm was a goat's gut. The byproduct of this process, the whey, is almost as important as the cheese. This greenish-yellow liquid, drained off the curds, is still packed with protein, vitamins, and a small amount of residual lactose. It's a crucial source of liquid calories and hydration. The Cyclops would drink this slightly tangy, refreshing, to him, anyway, liquid throughout the day. It's his sports drink, his morning coffee, and his nightcap, all in one. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops, given their isolated location and aversion to organized settlement, would have possessed the knowledge necessary for salting and fully aging cheese. Or if their dairy staples were limited to these soft, rapidly consumed fresh curds, if they were truly primitive, the absence of salt, a massive commodity in the ancient world, would severely limit their ability to make hard, durable cheeses like Parmigiano Reggiano. They would be locked into a diet of soft, highly perishable products that had to be consumed quickly, forcing a ceaseless, monotonous cycle of milking and curdling. This relentless cycle creates an immediate, palpable caloric foundation, one that is easy to produce in bulk and requires no complex cooking. You're watching the very definition of a survival staple. It is not food for enjoyment, it is fuel for a large, single-minded body. The thick silence of the cave, broken only by the rhythmic drip 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 of whey draining into a rough trench, is the sound of absolute, boring sustenance. As you settle deeper into the quiet reality of the Cyclops' pantry, the focus shifts from the creamy, sour dairy products to the earthier, greener elements of their diet. Away from the milky vats, you notice small, dried bundles tucked into the crevices of the rock wall. This is the pastoral pantry, wild foraging and herbs. Since the Cyclops scorns settled agriculture, he neither plants nor plows. Remember, he must rely on what the rough, volcanic land of Sicily provides naturally. You imagine the massive Cyclops lumbering across the hillsides, not in pursuit of adventure or glory, but simply gathering his daily greens. It's a surprisingly gentle, if still rudimentary, aspect of his life. This foraging provides essential nutrients that even the richest goat milk can't fully supply, breaking the absolute monotony of curds and whey, if only slightly. What he collects are not cultivated crops but tough, wild edibles. Think of the plants that thrive on marginal land: thistles, young nettle shoots, which, when boiled, lose their sting, and various kinds of wild garlic and onions. These aren't just food, they are powerful, natural flavor agents in a diet otherwise defined by blandness and acidity. He might chew on these raw, or perhaps boil them briefly in a simple pot to make a watery, bitter stew to accompany his cheese. This need for natural variety brings up a mainstream historical fact, even in the ancient world. Before modern medicine, people understood the value of local flora for both sustenance and remedy. The Cyclops wouldn't have a sophisticated pharmacy, but he would instinctively know which leaves and roots could aid digestion or act as mild antiseptics for the inevitable scrapes and cuts of a shepherd's life. You see dried sprigs of what appears to be wild thyme and oregano, hanging to dry. These aren't for gourmet seasoning, they're probably used functionally. Crushed thyme, with its strong, pungent aroma, could be rubbed onto dry pieces of meat before roasting, acting as a basic preservative or just masking the powerful gamey flavor of old goat. This suggests a very simple, utility-based understanding of botanical properties. Look closely at the ground outside the cave. Depending on the season, you'd find different small, wild fruits. Wild figs, bursting with natural sweetness, would be a major treat. They dry easily in the Mediterranean sun and, when consumed, provide a much-needed spike of sugar and quick energy. Then there are the wild berries, tough, tart things that stain the tongue purple, but offer vitamin C and a break from the eternal dairy diet. This is a very light joke. The Cyclops' version of a dessert is aggressively sour berry pucker followed by a massive piece of semi-aged sour cheese, a perfect palate cleanser, if your palate is made of iron. A quirky tidbit about the ancient Sicilian landscape, which is the mythical setting for the Cyclops, is the prevalence of silphium, or a similar giant fennel relative. While the famous North African silphium is distinct, the wild fennel that grows in the region would have been known for its strong flavor and medicinal properties. If the Cyclops did consume this, it would lend a sharp, and it's like bitterness to his simple boiled greens, another layer of flavor that screams wild and unrefined. You reflect on the Cyclops' relationship with the land. He doesn't dominate it, he simply harvests what it offers without effort. This passive interaction is key to his identity. He isn't a farmer fighting the soil, he is a predator and a gatherer living within the system. Historians still argue whether the gathering of certain wild edibles, particularly poisonous or psychoactive plants, contributed to the often described savage or drunken behavior of Polyphemus and his kin. While the text focuses on wine as the agent of his sleep, the consumption of strong, uncultivated herbs could certainly lead to unpredictable physical or mental states. Given their massive size, the dosage of even a mildly toxic plant would be enormous, potentially leading to a very, very long nap. The simple truth is that the green component of the Cyclops' diet is just as boring as the white. It's a relentless, low-effort collection of things that are free, tough, and nutrient-rich, but utterly lacking in variety, planning, or pleasure. He is not selecting his food, he is merely accepting what the hillside deigns to provide. The taste profile of the Cyclops is defined by sour dairy, bitter greens, and gamey meat, a trifecta of survival, not socialization. This sets the stage for the crucial, yet minimal, role of grains in his caloric equation. We now move from the rugged foraging of the Cyclops to the slightly heavier, more starchy elements that kept his enormous frame running. Step over the rough, goat hair rug and notice a few woven sacks tucked against the stone wall. These contain the bulk of his energy supply, what we're calling flax and fiber, ancient grains and porridge. Despite scorning the labor of plowing, the Cyclops still needed the dense, long-burning fuel that only grains could provide. This is where the mythology gets interesting, because the Cyclops is generally defined by his lack of civilization, including agriculture. However, the grains he consumes aren't the result of complex, settled farming. Instead, he likely foraged for wild cereal grasses or relied on the simplest, most primitive forms of grain preparation. His grains are tough, ancient varieties, think barley and emmer wheat, the foundational cereals of the Neolithic diet, not the soft, white flour of Roman bread. The preparation is the key to the monotony, lacking sophisticated grinding stones or ovens. The Cyclops' consumption of grain is reduced to one primary form, gruel or porridge. You hear a soft, rhythmic thump 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 coming from a shadowy corner. It's the sound of a crude stone mortar and pestle. The massive Cyclops has to pound the hard kernels repeatedly to crack them open. A necessity because whole grains take too long to cook and are difficult to digest. This is a life of manual, unrewarding labor. This endless task brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Throughout the Bronze Age Mediterranean, barley was the most common staple crop for the lower classes and military. Precisely because it is hardy, grows in poor soil, and yields reliably, it was often consumed not as bread, which required a complex infrastructure, but as maza, a thick, unleavened barley paste, or, more simply, boiled into a porridge. For the Cyclops, this boring, filling mash is the foundation of every major meal. You can almost taste the texture, a heavy, slightly slimy, and certainly bland porridge, possibly boiled with some whey for added protein, or maybe flavored with those bitter wild herbs we discussed earlier. It is the definition of survival eating, high in fiber, slow to digest, and utterly devoid of culinary ambition. It's joke number one. You might call the Cyclops' signature dish, curdled whey and crunchy grain gruel. It's the dish that puts the G in gastrointestinal distress, and the Z in ZZZZZZZZZ. The sheer volume of this gruel is staggering. Imagine a cauldron the size of a modern bathtub, perpetually simmering with this thick paste. The Cyclops wouldn't eat a small bowl, he'd eat a trough full. Simply scooping it up with his hand or perhaps a crude, large wooden ladle. Here's a quirky tidbit about ancient grains. Emmer wheat, a popular early variety, has a very tough outer husk, gloom, that requires parching, light roasting, before it can be pounded and eaten. This means the Cyclops, in his simplicity, would need to tend a low fire specifically to parch his grains, adding a subtle, smoky flavor to his inevitable gruel. It's a small concession to preparation, but the end product is still mush. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops, as inhabitants of Sicily, may have had access to rudimentary methods of baking flatbreads on hot stones, or if they were strictly limited to boiled grain preparations. If they did make a rough flatbread, it would be a dense, heavy, and very dry affair, requiring constant chewing and massive amounts of water or whey to wash down. Even the potential for bread offers no real relief from the relentless texture and minimal flavor profile. The importance of this flax and fiber lies in its stability. Unlike milk, which must be immediately processed, or meat, which spoils quickly, dried grain can be stored for long periods. The woven sacks you see represent his insurance policy against the leaner winter months. They are the visible, tangible sign of his isolationist economy, self-sufficient, sustainable, and mind-numbingly boring. You are looking at the culinary anchor of his life, a monotonous, sturdy diet of grain and curds that allows him to exist entirely outside of Greek civilization, waiting for a rare, unfortunate encounter to add variety, or tragedy, to his menu. This brings us inevitably to the single most sensationalized part of his diet, the consumption of men, and why that was the exception, not the rule. You've explored the endless cycle of curds, whey, and gruel, the monotonous staples that define the Cyclops' life. Now, you stand at the threshold of the most sensationalized and least representative part of their menu, the Polyphemus myth, eating man, or goat. The vivid scenes from Homer's Odyssey, the smashing of two sailors, the devouring of limbs, are what cemented the Cyclops in our popular imagination as a monstrous cannibal. Yet, when viewed through the lens of survival and caloric necessity, this man-eating is clearly the dramatic exception, not the boring, repeatable rule. You reread the narrative inside your head, watching Odysseus and his men, terrified and trapped. The Cyclops, Polyphemus, seals the cave entrance with a massive boulder, effectively turning his home into a larder for his primary food source, the animals, and, regrettably for the Greeks, his opportunistic secondary source, the intruders. The act of eating the sailors is sudden, violent, and highly ritualized by the narrative to emphasize Polyphemus's barbarity. He eats them raw, bones and all, like a mountain lion. But think practically. How many sailors could Polyphemus reasonably consume in a year? A dozen, perhaps, if he was extremely lucky with shipwrecks and lost travelers. This is an entirely unsustainable and unreliable food source. A large Cyclops, requiring thousands of calories daily for maintenance, simply cannot run his metabolism on the equivalent of human-sized or regular snacks. His existence depends on the daily, predictable output of his flocks. The sailor is not dinner, he's an emergency protein bar, a brief, exotic interlude in a diet of relentless, bland dairy. This leads us to a crucial mainstream historical fact: the consumption of raw meat, as described by Homer, was a major cultural marker used by the Greeks to denote a barbarian. Civilized Greeks cooked their meat, often sacrificing a portion to the gods. Raw meat consumption was the defining characteristic of the wild, the uncivilized, and the morally savage. Homer used the Cyclops' raw consumption of the sailors not because it was his daily routine, but because it was the most effective way to communicate his utter lack of civilization. The scene is better framed as a primal security breach. Odysseus and his men didn't ask permission, they trespassed. They stole food, and they were, from Polyphemus's perspective, tiny, aggressive pests endangering his real wealth, his sheep and goats. The consumption of the men, therefore, becomes a violent expression of territorial dominance and a deeply personal crime. Not just a dietary choice. It's less about satisfying hunger and more about violently removing a threat. Here's a quirky tidbit about the scene that highlights the diet discrepancy. Right before Polyphemus eats the first two men, the narrative meticulously describes him going through his normal, boring routine, milking the ewes, separating the curds, and setting the whey aside. This normal routine is interrupted by the presence of Odysseus. This structural choice by Homer confirms that the default mode of the Cyclops is shepherd, cheesemaker, and gruel eater. The cannibalism is the deviation prompted by the unexpected visitors. Historians still argue whether the infamous man-eating scene in the Odyssey was entirely metaphorical, intended to symbolize the devouring dangers of the sea and the unknown wild lands beyond the Greek polis, rather than a literal dietary note. If it is purely symbolic, it makes the Cyclops' daily consumption of goats and curds even more central to his material reality. He eats men to fuel the narrative, but he eats goats to fuel his body. So, when you think of Polyphemus's diet, remember that the vast majority of the time, The meat he consumed would have been old, tough goat or mutton, culled from the herd when it stopped producing milk or was past breeding age. This meat would be smoked or dried if possible, or perhaps occasionally roasted over a low, slow fire for hours. The sailor was a shock, the goat was the slow, inevitable meal. The drama is in the rare flesh, but the life is in the constant curds. And that, my friend, is what keeps the monster sleepy. Joke number 3. Polyphemus wasn't an evil mastermind. He was just a dairy farmer who hated surprise guests and preferred his protein to stand still. As the image of cannibalism fades back into the realm of rare, horrifying novelty, you turn your attention to the source of the Cyclops' true protein supplement, the vast, surrounding blue expanse. Despite living by the sea, the Cyclops isn't generally portrayed as a seafaring hunter, but his proximity to the coast means he certainly had access to salty sustenance, fish and coastal snacks. The Cyclops, lacking nets or boats, tools of civilized man, which he scorns, wouldn't be casting lines far out. His fishing is strictly shoreline scavenging, the easiest, most direct form of harvesting. Imagine the colossal figure wading knee-deep in the shallows or scouring the tide pools after a storm. What he gathers are not massive tuna or sophisticated catches, but the simple, plentiful bounty left exposed by the retreating waves. The primary target would be shellfish. You picture him prying heavy, calcium-rich limpets off the rocks with a rough stone, or perhaps collecting the tougher varieties of mussels and oysters found close to the shore. These require minimal effort to collect and, crucially, can often be eaten raw or simply placed on a hot stone to steam open, a cooking method primitive enough for the Cyclops' limited culinary skill set. This provides a necessary boost of minerals and iodine missing from his mountain dairy diet. This reliance on the shoreline for easy protein introduces a mainstream historical fact. Coastal peoples throughout the ancient world viewed the sea as a massive free pantry. Shellfish and small, trapped fish were often the primary source of protein for the poor or for communities that didn't invest in large-scale agriculture or organized deep-sea fishing. For the Cyclops, this scavenging reinforces his self-sufficient, low-effort lifestyle. You can almost hear the crack of a massive thumb crushing a clamshell. The taste would be intensely salty and metallic, a sharp contrast to the blandness of his gruel. He wouldn't rinse them, he would simply consume them. Seawater and all. This aggressive ingestion of salt is important for an animal herder who is constantly sweating and working in the sun. Along with the shellfish, he would also find sea vegetables, various forms of seaweed. While modern diets might treat seaweed as a delicacy, for the Cyclops, it's just another form of wild green, easily gathered and consumed raw for texture and minerals. It's tough, chewy, and profoundly mineral-rich, providing a necessary counterpoint to his heavy dairy intake. Here's a quirky tidbit regarding his seaside life. Given his size and the volcanic nature of Sicily's coastline, the Cyclops might have used natural geothermal vents, if present, or shallow tide pools heated by the sun as a primitive way to cook or parch his food without a large, managed fire. This gentle, low-heat cooking would slightly soften the tough texture of his catches. A tiny step toward preparation, but still far from boiling or roasting. The concept of preserving this catch is limited. He might lay small, caught fish on a sunny, flat rock to dry and cure into a basic jerky, cured fish. These tough, salty strips would last longer than fresh meat and could be gnawed on like hardtack alongside his barley porridge. It's a small concession to food storage, driven entirely by necessity, not by any desire for culinary delight. This is joke number 1. The Cyclops' idea of a surf and turf dinner is a handful of salty, raw limpets chased by a piece of tough, 3-day-old goat meat. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops, given their immense strength, would have occasionally thrown massive stones into the sea to stun or trap schools of larger fish, enabling them to harvest a greater haul than simple scavenging would allow. If they did, these large, infrequent catches would be immediately consumed, as the Cyclops lacks the sophisticated salting and smoking necessary for long-term preservation of bulky fish like cod or tuna. Regardless of the method, the overall impression remains the same. The coastal menu is supplementary, opportunistic, and entirely dependent on the lowest effort means of acquisition. He is a shepherd first, a forager second, and an occasional seaside scavenger third. The seaside snacks provide a salty, tough break from the curdled monotony of the hill cave, but they are no less primitive, ensuring that your journey remains safely in the realm of the deeply boring. We've established that the Cyclops' diet is overwhelmingly white, dairy, and green, foraged, with occasional salty bits from the sea. Now, we briefly turn to the red. But even here, the reality is a letdown. We're discussing the Bronze Age barbecue, roasting meats, rarely. While the consumption of human flesh is mythologically significant, the consumption of animal flesh is a caloric footnote, an infrequent, tough, and celebratory break from the curdled monotony. Think about the economics of a Bronze Age shepherd. Every animal in the flock is an asset. The ewes and goats produce milk and wool, the reliable daily income. Killing a productive female is a massive economic setback. Therefore, meat consumption is reserved for animals that have outlived their utility, old rams, sterile females, or injured animals. This is meat that is inherently tough, sinewy, and strong tasting. The Cyclops doesn't have a butcher shop. When an animal is slaughtered, the process is quick, messy, and driven by immediate need. The method of cooking is as primitive as his tools: open fire roasting. You see the massive, blackened hearth stone again. The fire isn't for warmth or light, it's a slow, smoky necessity. The preparation is simple. The meat, probably cut into large, irregular hunks, is skewered on massive, green branches or simply laid directly on the hot coals. No racks, no marinade, no careful seasoning beyond perhaps a generous rub of wild thyme or, more likely, a thick layer of fat from the slaughtered animal itself to keep it from drying out entirely. This cooking method, while romantic in modern eyes, results in unevenly cooked meat, charred on the outside, rare and chewy on the inside. This is a very light joke. The Cyclops' ideal temperature for his meat is safe enough not to complain. Which, given that he's the only one eating, means barely cooked. This rare act of roasting brings up a mainstream historical fact. The ability to cook meat consistently and thoroughly over a fire represents a significant advancement in human diet, as it increases digestibility and safety. For the Greeks, large-scale roasting was almost always associated with sacrificial feasts, where the aroma and the shared consumption held religious and social significance. For the Cyclops, however, the roasting of meat holds no social value. It is merely a practical way to consume the entire carcass of a tough animal before it spoils. It is a lonely, utilitarian feast. Imagine the amount of time this takes. A massive haunch of old mutton can't be rushed. The Cyclops would have to tend a low, smoky fire for hours, an activity that, in itself, is utterly monotonous. The consumption is rapid and direct, tearing large chunks of meat off the bone with his hands and teeth. There are no knives, no platters, and no conversation. Here's a quirky tidbit about the fat. The fat from sheep and goats, tallow and suet, is solid at room temperature and less desirable than rendered pork or olive oil. The Cyclops would likely consume this fat reluctantly, using it primarily as fuel for his cooking fire or, as mentioned, to baste the roasting meat. This heavy, waxy fat would contribute to a profound, gamey richness that, when paired with the sour dairy, defines his overwhelmingly intense flavor profile. The fact that meat is consumed rarely reinforces the stability of the dairy economy. He doesn't need meat every day. He needs curds and whey every day. The Bronze Age barbecue is an indulgence, a way to cull the herd, and an opportunity to absorb a massive, quick surge of protein and fat that tide him over until the next old animal is ready for culling. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops' general rejection of organized fire pits and domestic structures implies a cultural rejection of cooking altogether, or if the lack of descriptive cooking scenes in the Odyssey simply reflects Homer's focus on his general barbarity. If he rarely cooks, it makes the sheer volume of his raw or barely prepared curds, gruel, and forage greens even more pronounced as the true, dull anchors of his diet. The smell of smoke in the cave is a rare event, a brief exception to the dominant, constant odor of milk and manure. The scarcity of meat is key to understanding the sheer boredom of his sustenance. Having explored the solid, savory, and surprisingly bland components of the Cyclops' diet, We must now consider his hydration. You stand near a section of the cave floor that is perpetually damp, where fresh water is trickling down the stone wall. This is the source of his primary beverage, leading us into water, wine, and weak brews. Cyclopean thirst. For a creature of his size, working under the Mediterranean sun and subsisting on a diet rich in salt and dry dairy, hydration is a massive, constant requirement. His default, day-to-day drink is simple: cold spring water. You imagine the immense satisfaction of a Cyclops kneeling and scooping up gallons of fresh, clear water from a natural basin carved into the rock. This is the most reliable, and utterly non-alcoholic, element of his liquid intake. It cleanses the palate from the sour cheese and tough gruel. And it's free, perfect for a creature who values self-sufficiency above all else. However, the famous mythological interlude introduces a significant deviation: wine. In the Odyssey, Odysseus offers Polyphemus a potent, unmixed, and very sweet Maronian wine. The Cyclops, unaccustomed to such a beverage, drinks heavily and quickly falls into a deep, incapacitating slumber, allowing Odysseus to execute his escape plan. This tells us several important things about the Cyclops' usual habits. First, the wine is a shocking novelty. He is described as being completely overwhelmed by it, treating it as a miraculous, potent gift, not a common beverage. This suggests that his culture either doesn't produce wine or produces only the weakest, most rudimentary forms. Winemaking requires agriculture, cultivated grapes, time, fermentation, and storage, all hallmarks of the settled civilization the Cyclops reject. This point ties into a mainstream historical fact. Throughout the ancient world, it was considered civilized to drink wine diluted heavily with water, often at ratios of 1:3 or 1:5. Drinking wine straight, as the Cyclops does, was seen as an act of extreme barbarism, a sign of lack of self-control, and an inability to handle the finer aspects of culture. Homer uses the Cyclops' raw consumption of the wine to perfectly frame his uncivilized nature, just as he used his consumption of raw men. Given his herding economy, the closest he would come to fermentation would be very simple, weak, and likely sour brews made from a slight fermentation of his whey or perhaps a barley-based drink. These would have a low alcohol content and would be consumed mainly for their caloric and probiotic value, offering a mild tang rather than any intoxicating effect. They would be the definition of a weak brew, a kind of protocheese rather than a proper beer or wine. Here's a quirky tidbit about the ancient Maronian wine that fooled Polyphemus. It was legendary for being incredibly concentrated and needed to be mixed with up to 20 parts water before it was palatable to the Greeks. The fact that the Cyclops drinks it neat is not just a sign of his ignorance, it's a recipe for instant, spectacular inebriation. It's joke number 1. Polyphemus learned the hard way that when the Greeks offer you a nightcap, you should probably ask what the dilution ratio is. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops' unfamiliarity with wine suggests a complete abstinence from all fermented products, or if his massive tolerance simply meant that only a heroic dosage of an ultra-concentrated beverage like the Maronian wine could have affected him so profoundly. The scene relies heavily on the surprise of the strong drink to work, confirming its rarity in his daily life. The liquid aspect of the Cyclops' existence mirrors his food: simple, necessary, and overwhelmingly boring. Water, whey, and maybe a thin, sour barley broth. The story of the wine, much like the story of the man eating, is a fascinating but rare deviation from a life sustained by the clear, cold necessities of the Sicilian hillside. The only regular alcohol in his life is the subtle tang of slightly spoiled, fermented dairy. You've tasted the bland diet. Now let's examine the utterly primitive kitchen that produces it. We are looking at the culinary toolkit: stone, clay, and simplicity. For a being of the Cyclops' immense size, his tools are surprisingly few and utterly lacking in refinement. His toolkit reflects his philosophy: if it can't be sourced from the immediate environment or made with minimal effort, he doesn't need it. Walk over to the main living area. You notice the absence of metal. No bronze cauldrons, no iron spits, no finely crafted knives. Metal requires trade, mining, and advanced metallurgy, all features of the civilization the Cyclops shuns. His implements are massive, heavy, and functionally crude. His primary tools for preparation are stone mortars and pestles, the ones used for pounding his tough barley into manageable gruel. These aren't delicate, carved objects. They are likely natural boulders and smooth river stones, simply selected for their size and weight. The pounding action is pure brute force, converting hard grain into coarse meal. This repetitive, manual labor underscores the lack of mechanization in his life. For cooking and holding liquids, he relies on crude clay pots, if he uses them at all. These would be very simple, thick-walled vessels, likely made from local clay and fired in a low-temperature pit. Not a high-heat kiln. They are designed for durability and volume, not beauty. Their function is limited to boiling water, making gruel, or storing whey. You see large, shallow depressions carved into the rock floor, which serve as natural mixing bowls and storage vats for his dairy curds. The ground itself is his kitchen counter. This minimal technology highlights a mainstream historical fact. The invention and widespread use of pottery was a revolutionary step in ancient human diet, as it allowed for boiling. Boiling makes previously inedible foods, like tough grains or certain wild roots, digestible. And it allows for the creation of stews and gruels, which are essential for feeding large populations efficiently. The Cyclops uses boiling, but at the most basic level, just enough to soften the barley and make the gruel. For cutting and butchery, his tools are probably found objects, naturally sharp flint or obsidian shards. Or perhaps just a very heavy, flat stone used as a cleaver. His primary, knife, however, is likely his own immense hand and brute strength, simply tearing and pulling apart the tough carcasses of his sheep and goats. Here's a quirky tidbit about the storage. Because the Cyclops lives in a cool, damp cave, the constant high humidity is both a curse and a blessing. It helps keep his spring water cool, but it also means his dried goods, grains, herbs, must be stored in specialized, high-up crevices in the rock or in tightly woven baskets to prevent them from molding or germinating. He is constantly fighting the environment to preserve his simple bounty. The lack of any sophisticated equipment means the food is never truly cooked in a way we understand. It is either boiled, gruel, curdled, cheese, dried, fish, herbs, or rudimentarily roasted, meat. The absence of a grinding mill means his grains are always coarse. The absence of sophisticated pottery means he never has a true stew. And the absence of a proper oven means no baked goods. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops, as master stonemasons in some later mythological traditions, the builders of the walls of Mycenae and Tiryns, might have used their skill with stone to create more sophisticated culinary tools, such as advanced grinding stones or specialized vessels. The Homeric tradition, however, paints them as complete anti-intellectuals, limiting their use of stone purely to the pragmatic, crude cleavers. Massive door-blocking boulders. We must assume, for maximum sleep-inducing monotony, that his tools are as boringly functional as possible. This simplicity is the final lock on his bland diet. Without the tools for refinement, there can be no refined cuisine. His enormous size is fed by a kitchen that belongs to the Stone Age. A place where simplicity is not a choice, but a default setting. Joke number 2. The Cyclops' cooking philosophy is, if it fits in my hand, it fits in my stomach. If it doesn't, I just use a bigger hand. We have the food and we have the tools. Now let's talk about the fuel required for such an immense engine. We are delving into cyclopean metabolism, the caloric reality. It's time to ground this myth in the boring science of nutritional requirements. How much does a creature the size of Polyphemus actually need to eat to survive on a daily basis? And how does his diet of curds and gruel stack up? Imagine the sheer body mass. A Cyclops is often depicted as being several times the size of a man. Let's assume, conservatively, that an active, muscular Cyclops weighs around 10 times a modern, average human male. Perhaps around 1.500 to 2.000 pounds, or roughly 680 to 900 kilograms. His basal metabolic rate, the energy needed just to exist, would be astronomical. Factor in his daily activities, walking up and down the steep Sicilian hills, moving massive boulders, milking hundreds of animals, and pounding grain, and his total caloric expenditure easily skyrockets. A typical ancient Greek agricultural laborer might need 3.000 to 4.000 calories a day. The Cyclops, by conservative estimate, would need 15.000 to 20.000 calories per day just to maintain his size and activity level. This is where the sheer, monotonous volume of his diet becomes a necessity. This calculation leads us to a mainstream historical fact. The primary limiting factor in the expansion of ancient populations was often not disease or war, but the ability to reliably source dense, storable, and easily processed calories. For the Cyclops, his reliance on dairy is his solution. Consider the calorie density of his staples. A pound of typical ancient hard cheese or aged curds could easily contain 1.500 to 2.000 calories, primarily from fat and protein. His barley gruel, while less dense, still packs in high amounts of complex carbohydrates. To reach his 20.000 calorie goal, the Cyclops would need to consume roughly 10 to 12 pounds of mixed cheese and thick gruel daily. This translates to a relentless, day-long grazing pattern. He isn't eating 3 meals, he's constantly fueling the machine. The diet is effective because it is fat and protein heavy, from the goat and sheep products, which provides sustained energy release, crucial for a life of constant physical labor. The tough, high-fiber barley gruel adds bulk and complex carbs, which burn slowly. It's a perfect, if profoundly unappetizing, survival diet. Here's a quirky tidbit about his single eye. Some scientists theorize that the mythological Cyclops may have been inspired by ancient discoveries of fossil elephant skulls, like the dwarf elephant of Sicily, which feature a large, central nasal cavity that could be mistaken for a single, giant eye socket. If this is true, the sheer size of the Cyclops's head, required to house such a large orbit, would necessitate an enormous caloric input just for brain function, further justifying his endless appetite for bland survival food. The efficiency of the dairy economy is paramount. Grass is converted into milk with relatively little energy input from the Cyclops, making his calories easily renewable. He doesn't need to hunt constantly, which is highly inefficient. He just needs to milk, curdle, and pound. This is joke number 1. You know you're a Bronze Age giant when your biggest daily chore is generating enough stomach space to handle another mountain of unsalted cheese. Historians still argue whether the exaggerated size and appetite of the Cyclops was intended to symbolize the untamable, raw power of nature itself, reflecting the massive, unpredictable forces that the Greeks were just beginning to conquer through agriculture and civilization. If he is a stand-in for nature, his metabolism must be insatiable and his diet must be simple, reflecting the Earth's raw bounty, milk, wild plants, rather than human ingenuity, cultivated food. The caloric reality strips away the magic and replaces it with the dull thump of constant eating. His life is defined by the necessary, repetitive task of acquiring, processing, and consuming massive volumes of 2 basic, unflavored staples. It is an existence of pure, functional, sleepy sustenance. You understand now the sheer, constant caloric need of the Cyclops. This immense requirement, however, must be met within the constraints of the seasons, leading us to a discussion of the Lenten lifestyle, feast, famine, and storage. The Cyclops's life isn't a continuous harvest. It's a constant battle against spoilage and the leaner, colder months. In the late spring and summer, when the wild grasses are rich and the ewes and goats are lactating heavily, the Cyclops experiences his feast, a time of genuine abundance. He is swimming in milk, curds, and whey. His problem during this time is not finding calories, but preserving the excess. This dictates his entire focus. He must immediately process the milk into his large, acidic curds, and then try to protect them. This intense seasonal focus brings up a mainstream historical fact: the invention of techniques for food preservation, salting, drying, fermentation, was just as critical to the rise of civilization as agriculture itself. It allowed for the decoupling of production and consumption, making winter survival possible. The Cyclops, lacking sophisticated methods, must rely on the simplest and often least palatable techniques. His key method is drying and fermenting. The fresh curds are highly acidic, which is a natural preservative, slowing the growth of harmful bacteria. To make them last longer, he would press them heavily, extracting all remaining whey, and then allow the resulting hard, white cheese to dry slowly in the cool, circulating air of the cave. These heavy, sun or air-dried lumps of cheese are his winter insurance policy. They are tough, pungent, and dry, but they are stable. As the late autumn arrives, the milk production of the flocks drops off dramatically. The animals breed less, the grass dies back, and the Cyclops enters his period of famine, or at least, scarcity. During this time, his entire diet relies on his stores, the dried curds, the sacks of coarse barley gruel, and any cured, tough meat saved from a late-season cull. The flavor profile of his diet becomes even more monotonous and less fresh, sour, earthy, and dry. You can sense the change in the cave's aroma. The thick, creamy smell of fresh milk is replaced by the dusty odor of dried grain and the intense, sharp scent of heavily aged cheese. This is a life lived in stark contrast between the liquid abundance of summer and the dry scarcity of winter. Here's a quirky tidbit about ancient food storage. For the long-term preservation of small meat portions, the Cyclops might have coated the tough, cured strips of meat we mentioned earlier in a thick layer of animal fat, tallow. This created a sealed, anaerobic barrier, similar to a primitive confit, that kept the air out and the meat from drying out further. The resulting meal would be a high-calorie, intensely greasy, and immensely boring block of fat and protein. The cyclical nature of his diet is a testament to his antisocial existence. He doesn't need trade or external supply chains because he handles the feast and famine cycle entirely within his cave and his flock. He is, in effect, a biological bank, converting seasonal solar energy, grass, into a fat-rich deposit, cheese, for later use. This is joke number 1. The Cyclops' idea of a winter stock-up is just making a cheese ball so large it can double as a cave entrance blocker. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops' isolation was truly by choice, rejecting society and its benefits, or if they were forced into marginal lands by more technologically advanced agricultural groups who took the fertile valleys. If they were marginalized, their simple, tough reliance on pastoralism and self-sufficiency for survival during scarcity becomes a pragmatic necessity, not just a philosophical choice, reinforcing the functional, unromantic nature of their diet. The understanding of this cycle gives you a deeper appreciation for the relentless, quiet work that is the core of the Cyclops' life. It is a slow, boring, but necessary grind that provides the two most critical qualities for his massive body: consistency and volume, even when the taste is dreadful. As we approach the end of the Cyclops' menu, we encounter a surprising absence: olive oil and the absence of fat. When you think of the ancient Mediterranean diet, your mind immediately goes to the holy trinity of staples: wheat, wine, and olive oil. Yet, the Cyclops' diet is fundamentally missing the most critical element of this trio: the oil. Olive oil was more than just a foodstuff in the Greek and Roman worlds. It was a commodity, a currency, and a foundational element of culture. It was used for cooking, anointing, lighting, and bathing. The Cyclops, however, rejects agriculture, and olive trees require cultivation, pruning, and sophisticated pressing. For him, the immense effort and social coordination required to produce oil simply aren't worth the trouble. This rejection creates a massive dietary gap. The Cyclops is left without a source of liquid, easily digestible, and delicious fat. He must rely entirely on animal fats, primarily the tough, saturated fats derived from his sheep and goats, like tallow and butterfat, clarified or otherwise. This reliance on animal fat brings up a mainstream historical fact: the geographic line between butter, tallow-consuming cultures, the pastoralists of northern Europe and the Near Eastern highlands, and olive oil-consuming cultures, the settled peoples of the Mediterranean littoral, was a profound cultural and culinary divide. The Cyclops, as an uncivilized pastoralist, clearly falls on the tallow side of this line, reinforcing his barbarian status in Greek eyes. You can imagine the difference in taste and texture. Olive oil is smooth, aromatic, and easy to use as a dressing for rough greens. Tallow, by contrast, is hard, waxy, and imparts a heavy, gamey flavor. The Cyclops doesn't drizzle his food, he coats it in heavy, rendered fat when he can spare it, giving his gruel and dried meats a greasy, powerful mouthfeel that we would find deeply unappetizing and hard to digest. Here's a quirky tidbit that explains this avoidance. Wild olives do exist in the Mediterranean, but they are small, tough, and extremely bitter, requiring intensive processing to become palatable. The Cyclops likely saw the wild olive as an inedible curiosity, confirming his prejudice that agriculture and its attendant labors were unnecessary. He never bothered to domesticate the tree, thus denying himself the single greatest fat source of his geographical region. His lack of liquid fat also impacts his few attempts at cooking. Without oil, anything he bakes on a hot stone, if he ever did, would be dry and brittle. Anything he roasts would be basted in its own melting fat, which, when it cools, turns waxy and unappealing. The absence of olive oil is a defining lack, sealing the fate of his cuisine as heavy, dry, and intensely saturated. This rejection is also a rejection of pleasure. Olive oil is the base of flavor in Mediterranean cooking, it enhances everything it touches. By relying on heavy animal fats, the Cyclops is prioritizing caloric density over palatability. He is eating for crude power, not for gustatory delight. This is the third joke. The Cyclops never had to worry about running out of butter, because he was too busy enjoying his own signature cooking oil, rendered goat fat. Historians still argue whether the later mythological stories, which sometimes link the Cyclops to the volcanic forging of metal for the gods, imply they might have, at some point, had external contact that could have provided them with traded commodities like olive oil. However, the Homeric tradition is very clear: they have no ships, no trade, and no civilization. Their diet is a pure reflection of their isolation, an isolation defined by the lack of refined, traded goods like oil. The overall impression is one of heavy, unrelieved density. The fat in the Cyclops' diet is not a subtle background note, it is a major, impactful player, derived entirely from his flock. And it serves only one master, his relentless, boring metabolism. This finally allows us to understand the purpose of his bland diet: food as pure, solitary fuel. We've charted the whole culinary landscape of the Cyclops, a journey defined by its profound lack of excitement, the curds, the gruel, the tough, rare meat, and the total absence of olive oil. Now we arrive at the philosophical reason for this blandness. Beyond boredom, the social function of food. For the Cyclops, food is not a source of pleasure, variety, or even culture. It is purely for solitary, necessary fuel, a perfect reflection of his antisocial nature. Think about what a meal represents in any human society. It's a structure for socializing, a moment of sharing, a context for ritual, and a subject for conversation. The Greek symposium, for example, was an entire cultural institution built around shared food and wine. The very act of preparing, serving, and consuming food together defines civilization. The Cyclops rejects all of it. His meals are solitary, quick, and functional. He is never described as sitting down to converse, offer hospitality, unless it's a trap, or share his bounty. He eats alone, in silence, tearing at his food with his hands. The sheer size of his portions, those 10+ pounds of curds and gruel, necessitates a focus on consumption over enjoyment. His mealtime is an extension of his labor, simply the final, necessary step of the day's work, converting grass into giant muscle. This antisocial structure brings up a mainstream historical fact. The Greek word for barbarian, barbaros, was originally an onomatopoeia for the incomprehensible noise of foreign speech. But it quickly became linked to uncultured behavior, including a lack of commensality, the civilized custom of eating together. By dining alone, and by eating his food raw or roughly cooked, the Cyclops is performing his barbarity for Homer's audience. His diet is a political and cultural statement of absolute rejection. The sheer, consistent monotony of the diet is a critical mechanism for sleep. The lack of variety means the Cyclops never has to think about his food. There is no choice to make, no recipe to follow, no new flavor to excite the brain. It is the ultimate expression of culinary zero effort. which in turn allows the mind to slow down and focus only on the rhythmic, heavy task of chewing and swallowing. The food itself is designed to make you sleepy, heavy, and quiet. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Cyclops' diet and its impact on his personality. A diet so overwhelmingly dominated by acidic, unaged dairy and tough, fiber-rich gruel would likely lead to chronic indigestion and flatulence. This is not a fun, light diet, it's a heavy, fermenting one. His legendary grumpiness and violent temper might not be purely psychological. It could be the result of a perpetually unhappy digestive system. Joke number 1. The real reason the Cyclops was isolated was that his neighbors couldn't stand the sound of his digestion after a 3-pound gruel dinner. The Cyclops' food is, therefore, merely fuel he consumes for quantity and caloric stability. The occasional, rare human is not a planned dish, it's an emotional outburst. The rest of the time, he is the embodiment of nutritional discipline, a slave to his high-caloric necessity. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops, through their isolation and lack of social structure, had developed a unique, non-verbal form of communication, perhaps relying on bellows or gestures, or if their solitude was so complete that they had no need for developed language at all. Their food, being solitary, perfectly matches a life without dialogue or shared cultural experience. There is no need for words like delicious, share, or please. You stand here realizing that the greatest lesson of the Cyclops' diet is that boring food equals a boring life. And a boring life is one that doesn't need to stay awake to be recorded. You've now fully absorbed the quiet, heavy reality of his daily existence. All that remains is the final, dull, and peace-inducing meal before sleep. The sun has set over the Sicilian hills, and the cool air of the evening now permeates the cave, bringing with it the faint, comforting sounds of the settled flock. The massive, monotonous day is drawing to a close, and you are ready for the final, quiet ritual. The final meal, peace, quiet, and simplicity. This is the moment that defines the Cyclops' true nature, not the man-eating frenzy, but the slow, heavy process of refueling before rest. You watch the gigantic shadow as the Cyclops prepares his final, unremarkable meal. There is no elaborate cooking, no fire, and no anticipation. It is a moment of pure, necessary consumption. His day has been one of strenuous labor, milking, separating curds, and moving the heavy livestock. Now, the machine needs its final infusion of slow-burning calories to last the long night. He reaches for his 2 reliable staples. First, a large, heavy lump of pressed cheese curds, probably a day or 2 old, intensely sour and firm. He doesn't cut it, he simply tears a portion off with his fingers. The powerful smell of lactic acid filling the cool air. The texture is rough and slightly grainy from the minimal pressing. He chews slowly, ruminating more than savoring. Second, he takes a massive, crude ladle and scoops a generous amount of thick barley gruel from the communal clay pot. The gruel is room temperature. A bland, pasty mash of cracked grain, maybe mixed with leftover whey. It is heavy, damp, and utterly unexciting. This combination, the fat and protein from the cheese, the complex carbs from the gruel, is his final, predictable anchor of the day. This nightly routine perfectly illustrates a mainstream historical fact. The Bronze Age diet for most common people was overwhelmingly dominated by 2 ingredients, grain and dairy. And the final meal of the day was almost always the heaviest. Designed to maximize overnight energy reserves and keep hunger at bay until the morning. This cyclical, predictable eating pattern is the foundation of agrarian and pastoral life. The Cyclops consumes this meal in absolute silence. There is no clinking of pottery, only the low, wet sounds of chewing and swallowing. His massive body processes the food with the efficiency of a stone mill. There is no thought given to variety, spice, or pleasure. The food is simply working, doing its silent, boring job. Here is a quirky tidbit to close the culinary journey: the tough, chewy nature of the Cyclops' food, the heavily fibered gruel, the tough dried meat, the dense curds, would have required immense jaw strength and hours of cumulative chewing per day. The simple act of mastication would be a constant, muscle-tiring labor, effectively wearing him out physically just before he lies down to sleep. The food literally helps put him to rest. Historians still argue whether the quiet self-sufficiency and deep isolation of the Cyclops, which necessitates this boring diet, represent a form of rejection of the chaotic, politically complicated world of the Greek heroes, or if it is simply the only viable way to sustain a being of such size in a marginal environment. Regardless, his final meal is the ultimate statement of that independence, a plate of self-made, unshared, and profoundly quiet sustenance. He finishes the last of his curds, washes it down with a scoop of cold spring water, and settles his enormous frame onto the rough bedding of straw and hide. The day's labors are done. The belly is full of heavy, slowly digesting fuel, and the brain has been safely lulled into submission by the absence of culinary excitement. This is the true, sleepy reality of the myth, not the terrifying cannibal, but the tired, self-sufficient shepherd, heavy with cheese and barley, sinking into a deep, dreamless sleep. Blank. Blank. The quiet has deepened now, settling over the cave like a thick, comforting blanket of moss. You can feel your own breath slowing, matching the vast, easy rhythm of the sleeping giant nearby. The rough, earthy smell of the cave, the faint, lowing sounds of the livestock, the memory of that thick, heavy gruel, it all combines into a profound stillness. Allow the images of the fierce storms and the heroic battles to drift away. Focus instead on the relentless, simple physics of survival we've discussed. The smooth, cool stone of the floor beneath you. The steady drip of spring water. The sense of ancient time moving at the pace of grass growing on a hillside. This is where the true rest lies, in the boring, predictable continuity of the ancient world. Let your muscles relax. Let the weight of the day settle gently out of your shoulders. The work is done. The fear is unnecessary. There is no excitement, no surprise, and no drama left in this cave. Only the sound of a very large creature having a very, very deep sleep, fueled by the most monotonous diet imaginable. You are safe. You are warm. Drift now into that heavy, quiet space. Let the simple, repeated rhythm of the Cyclops' life, milk, curds, gruel, sleep, become your own mantra. You are ready to rest.